Uh, my name is Beirgan Kay, or Bear, and I'm not really sure how to explain the zines, so I'm just going to walk you through what made them, and then we'll go with questions. I want to preface this by acknowledging that I've been Captain TMI, too much information over the years. I talk for too long and I share way too much of my inner self. This has made people uncomfortable in the past, and I've felt guilt and embarrassment around this, especially recently. I try to do it to keep the skeletons out of my closet, but they might trigger the ones in yours. So I apologize. Going forward, I don't know how to talk about my zines. There are so many details, and these zines are roadmaps to my emotional landscape throughout the times of physical stagnancy. But there are so many detours on the way to where I am now. So let's treat this like a road trip, and let me know if you have to pee. Also, no, we are really not there yet. We're gonna go? I clicked it. Made a little boop.
Okay, just wait for it.
There it is. Last year at the beginning of quarantine, I got lost in myself. Not in a self-discovery way, but more like a being lost in the woods way. Like I could tell you I was in the woods, but that was about it. I panicked. So I started building a cabin. The hands-on work was who I was. I was the creator of that thing, and that's all I had to worry about. Planning it and carrying the supplies up into the woods was my day-to-day. Time passed differently up there. The whole day could be an hour, or what felt to be 2 days. Some days felt like weeks, and others felt like seconds. And I grew alongside my creation, from the foundations made at the end of my junior year to the bones built and supports made by the end of the summer. But then I reached the beginning of my senior year, and I just needed to put on the walls and the roof. I needed more hands to help me at this point, and I didn't know how to ask. And honestly, the idea of finishing this creation scared me, because it was supposed to get me through the pandemic, and I could have friends over in the few months that it would last. But the cabin was almost finished, and it was still here. And with the end of the cabin drawing near, I was still lost in myself. So I panicked and started looking at the outside world. There were protests going on, and mutual aid was desperately needed. I started organizing donations and running them to Madison, Milwaukee, and other places after work. I remember one of the days I was doing runs. I didn't leave until 10 p.m. or maybe later because I had to gather things and pack my car. I got into Milwaukee around 1 and had to get up at 4 to make sure everything got to the drop spots at the right time. And I still had to make it home for work. Those 3 hours were the best hours of sleep I've ever had. I remember the satisfying feeling of pulling into my destination highly caffeinated under the red rising sun. But soon enough, everyone was fed, and the all-school camping trip was upon us, and I panicked again. Deciding my senior project meant I was a senior. So I put it off as long as possible. Now in school, I couldn't hide away in mutual aid runs or in the woods. I had to stare down the monster of moving time that I so very much feared. My first few thoughts were either based on the cabin or in the vein of a graphic novel, but neither sat right with me. I was in the transcendentalism class at the time and started criticizing Thoreau's Walden Pond heavily. Maybe I shouldn't have trash-talked a dead man's writing ability because it was a different time, but I did. I absolutely tore his literature apart. And now after spending a year similar to his in isolation, I've grown to appreciate all the grocery lists he added in. So I was playing with the idea of zines. I just started off by journaling and drawing in the fall, and this is where I started to shut down and filter myself right away. As I write this speech, I find myself in the same place of censorship. This fear comes from two things. Communication nowadays is fragile. Like an ember, if I blow too hard, it will burn itself out, and no warmth will come from it. And 2, it's a small town, so everyone has seen a side of the story. Going forward, I'm speaking only of my experience and failures. No one in my life has failed me beyond myself. I thought the feeling of empty would leave once I started school, but I realized, pandemic or not, I was already kind of socially isolated. I've always had anxiety and assumed that if I'm not contacted, I'm not missed. If I wasn't directly invited, I'm not welcome or wanted. Adding this to a time of isolation, I only had contact with 3 people. So that translated in my brain to I'm only wanted or missed by 3 people. Cue anxiety and depression, her side fling. I don't mean to be dramatic, but all the people from past years I loved dearly were gone now. And there are so many new faces that mingled and made new groups that I was too tired to wiggle my way into. Going to school started to create a physical ache, and we sat far away from each other. But even with the groups and everyone distance, I felt like I was at the edge of a group. Like a lonely atom, I felt like I bounced around trying to find a bond. But alas, I wasn't needed. Cue anxiety and her other side fling, paranoia. Constantly at the back of my mind, there's this little nagging voice. How selfish to put your family at rest. You don't know what you could mess up. You're bound to mess up. The little voices whisked me away into fear, and I pulled out of school and sank into a depressive episode of hiding away in my room. I thought that I had fixed my COVID exposure levels, but then there was close call after COVID close call, and I really didn't feel safe seeing my friends, because now the threat came from my home life. So I masked and bubbled and waited for my tests, which didn't help the depressive episode. Functioning out of my room made it hard to leave. I grew anxious to be awake. Being conscious of our current reality was too much, but it was a lurking monster I could avoid with sleep. I spent most of my time locked away in happy spots in my brain, but even those began to turn the blankets into fabric trains holding me to my bed. These sheets wrapped around and constricted me, and I became to melt into the unconscious. I needed to free myself, so I moved out. I started living with a friend and distance dating my new partner. I was in a new dynamic, which helped me in a way, but created a new type of isolation. I was terrified to be vulnerable. I masked for comfort because someone who I was living with, even seeing my face, made my heart speed up. I didn't want to be perceived. I completely pulled out of all socializations. I was hiding from the world. Or I wasn't hiding from the world exactly. I was more hiding from time and from me. Living with people, no matter how loving, made me panic. The idea of being open hurt because I feared the end. I've always feared the end of something, to the point of which I spent a good amount of my younger years crying about how everyone I would love would die one day. So, to avoid that vulnerability, I started to live alone. I justified it as a COVID precaution, but it was a really unhealthy way of isolating myself so I wouldn't hurt anyone around me. So now, with the winter slowly marching towards us, I lived alone, and my only socializations were with my new boyfriend. We'd meet at the park and distance picnic. I remember sitting in my car right before the first park meetup. I gripped the steering wheel, white-knuckled and nervous. I had to keep telling myself that it was okay and not to drive away, and I ended up throwing my keys into the messy abyss that is my back seat. So I couldn't drive off. At the time, I played it off as first date butterflies or just nervous about seeing someone in the pandemic. But in reality, it was a fear of creating vulnerability again. I remember when we merged germ bubbles and his family invited me over for Thanksgiving. It had been the first time I had a family dinner in around 87 days, along with the first time other humans had seen my full face. I took a long time to enter the threshold of the house and slowly integrated myself into their home. I compared it to, at the time, to what you do with a new fish. I was simply sitting in my little bag, waiting for the water's temperature to match. I remember returning home to a cold, dark, soulless house and crying. I was still on my own. I continued hiding away and doing my daily tasks to distract myself from me. I was still metaphorically in the deep of the woods, completely confused and cold. and I didn't want to confront the lurking monsters in the shadows. I remember how much I hated that empty house, because it reflected my inner world too well. I'd leave my bed unmade and dishes dirty just so I had something tying me back to that place. And then the ties were cut. I had to make a new plan in a few days. I cried for a really, really, really long time because although that house was empty, it was what I had left of a sanctuary. I remember thinking I couldn't be vulnerable anymore, and I didn't feel wanted anywhere. I cried and yelled and laughed in my car and drove for hours. I called many wise people in my life, but they didn't have time on that specific day at that specific moment, which logically made sense, but oh, did that fully cement the feeling of being alone. I had nothing built inside of me to support my inner growth anymore. I realized this as I was sobbing that night as I packed my things. I'm not sure how to describe this to you, but I'll give it a shot. Do you know when you're crying and it goes and it goes and it peaks and then it starts to go down and you start to self-comfort? Well, when you have no inner comforting system left, you don't self-soothe. You just cry and it feels like the walls are continuously crashing down upon you. Or, a different way to describe it, it feels like you slip and fall and your gut wrenches and your heart speeds up and it builds and no relief from the impact. As I sat and cried, I realized I was fully lost in myself. The loss of the little characteristics I had built in that empty house was a representation of how I lost them in myself. Because of a heavy weekend at my workplace at the time, I couldn't see my partner until my test results came back. I couldn't hug anyone anymore. I was alone and almost homeless. I was going to sleep in my car. I had a moment of defiance and fear of not being in control and decided that it was good that I was alone. I could do whatever I wanted and it was just me in harm's way. This, I think, was my darkest night. I've lost every little thing, all of the living situations I could possibly do to put me in a situation where I could see my family or friends again. I wouldn't be able to be bubbled with the people I loved. I remember sobbing that last night I was able to be in that empty house as the neighbors downstairs had a raging party. I eventually broke out laughing at how drastically different our nights were going. And as I decided I was all I had left, my partner convinced me to come by, and so I did. And masked at the end of his driveway, he greeted me with half of his blankets and a cake and a plea for me to not run off into the woods, to never be seen again. It was really hard to not run off into the woods, and that night I drove around for hours, watching the glittering snow swirl around on the road, and I cried into my Kentucky butter cake. I had to face the deep, dark shadows of the night on my own, the empty howls, the tricks of the eye, and the bitter, biting cold of isolation, which was made significantly worse by the fact that I don't have heat in my Jeep, and it was a winter night in Wisconsin. And the realization that I made be the thing that I had been fearing most. But I made it through, and I'm embarrassed to say, but I lived in a pop-up camper in my partner's driveway. I didn't want to take the help because it meant I would have to rely on someone else. I didn't want any vulnerability. I couldn't take being vulnerable anymore, but I tried it. It was my one last shot at removing myself from those howling woods, so I took it. I took the offer, and I waited for him to tell me I was too much of a burden. But all he brought me was dinner and a smile and a hug every night. So I figured he was too Midwestern to tell me. So I tried to lessen my burdenness, such as not going into their house to pee, which meant I went 3 days without peeing, which I think is pretty impressive, but also unhealthy. And then winter got colder and the hugs and food started to be accompanied by, you know you can come in, right? Which turned into, my mom wants you to know that you can come in. Which I would nod and smile, dismissing the invitation because obviously it was just out of politeness. Because at the time I couldn't accept anyone actually wanting me around. But those words would turn into, hey, come in for dinner. And I did. I was terrified to cross the threshold of that door again. I was terrified to lose this home just as I did the rest. I had been wanted or welcomed many times in my life, but those occasions that were promised to be forever were really only for a week or for weeknights, or for other measurements of time, which makes sense seeing that each person's life is different. I think it was also hard to cross that doorway into the warmth and light because I had become the lurking shadows I had feared earlier on. I had let the dark consume me and I was truly lost in it. But I did, and it slowly got easier each time. But I still feared the care. I didn't want to tax it out. I didn't want to break the last thing that made me sane. But it didn't break. In fact, it started to make me feel whole. I experienced what it felt like to be able to be vulnerable and cared for again. And it caused the most intense fear I've ever experienced in my life. I had put my heart out and anxiously waited for it to be crushed. I'd close my eyes and wince, waiting for the pain that never came. All he did was take care of me, and I cried in front of him. I cried so many times because I hadn't been able to fully let my guard down for months. I would say that I overstayed my welcome each night and started to panic, trying to figure out where to go next. And he'd always remind me that this is where I could be until I had a house. I didn't need to run away from the warmth, and it took a while to realize that. This was the first time this whole year I didn't flee from panic and fear. I started to grow and dream again. I daydreamed of starting a business, and I started to entertain the idea and talk about it with my parents, with my partner and his family. They all said go for it, so I did. I spent my most depressive months building this dream into reality with my dear friend Lucia. This is when the sun was just starting to reach the sky, and I started to recognize my surroundings in this forest of dull numbness. I cemented our launch date, and it started to come up fast. And somehow we pulled it together and still missed it because we're two teens trying to start a pop-up restaurant. But thanks to the guidance of Danny and full-on support of her, we got to cater at one of her events. And now I'm proud to say I'm head of a pop-up restaurant with Lucia named Moonbear. I spent this time plucking my daydreams and pulling them into reality, from knitting projects to baking. I did whatever I dreamt, and I lived on that high of living in my dream, which got dampened by my 18th birthday, when the shadows spewed out of the walls again and I had to face the death of my childhood. I cried and held myself under a blanket, desperately wanting a hug from my mom. I had the realization I may not live with my family again, which meant I'd be out of my little brother's life. I had fear fading from his memory and childhood, and my heart ached so much it felt like it had split. As the clock struck midnight, nothing happened. No smoke cloud, no tiny fireworks, no gremlin coming to revoke my rights to the kids' menu at restaurants. I was just able to go to jail now and vote. So now I'm a super powerful child with a steady income. I've almost overcome most of my monsters. This isn't to say I'm out of the woods yet. I'm still facing a lot of fear and scary things, but I'm slowly on my way. I still have no idea what I want or where I'll be next month, but I know I'm not anywhere near my final destination. These zines are raw parts of me cultivated from what I just expressed my year to be. I made them in a digital format, and if you'd like access to them, just email me at beirgankay@yahis.net. Now I'd like to thank people. Thank you to my parents for raising me to be capable. Thank you to Danny for her kitchen. Thank you to Stephanie for being my mentor and editor and giving me honest feedback on very vulnerable content. Thank you, Lucia, for making Moonbear come true. Thank you to peripheral advisors such as Zoe, Matt, Erica, and Sean. And thanks, Sebastian. So yeah. Also, thank you to Shelley Brennan for being a wonderful community mentor, wonderful role model, and second mom. So, kind of questions, I guess, now. Yeah.
Yes.
gotta just leave that. I like your lumps up there. That's really good.
Yeah.
Eleanor DeClerc, you are a great 8th grade buddy. Oh God, that's
Yes,
good.
Dad.
Oh,
My
Are you
good
going
dear.
on adventures in the van this summer?
Yeah, I'm going off Zoom to like Colorado in 6 days.
Are you?
Zoom.
6 days?
Yeah, I have to fix the brake lines before that.
Or it'll really be Zoom.
I have no questions, just digital love and hugs. You are so incredibly strong and courageous. Thank you for sharing this painful and poignant and beautiful journey. I am so incredibly proud of you. Love you, Bear. You are a champion.
Can I speak away?
No, you can't. Sorry. On the rug, please.
Just put a tape X here,
Yeah.
like slime zone.
Joan,
Hi.
you should relax your hand. You're gonna get carpal tunnel if you do that. Just relax it. Any other a question or for something for Bear? Again.
What's up with the cabin?
The cabin?
Yeah.
I don't want to finish it.
We're gonna leave it, let's just like,
No, I spent like $700 on plywood for the roof or plywood and metal for the roof. And beyond emotional avoidance, I'm also extremely afraid of heights. So it's been a really fun combo. Yeah, but that hopefully should be done soon-ish. Kind of. And the cabin was also made out of all recycled materials. That was a big push for it. It's mostly made out of pallets and feed bags and everything I could scrap. Yeah, what up?
Egon wants to know why you moved out of your house.
What?
Egon wants to know why you moved out of your house.
COVID exposure.
Okay. Like Egon, were you listening?
So that should,
Do you want any help with the cabin?
yeah. Are you afraid of heights?
No.
All right, sweet.
Yeah.
Also, the other part I didn't mention is I let my dad pick the location, so it's so pretty, but 2 miles into the woods.
No, it's a quarter mile.
Okay. It feels like 2 miles with like 2 pallets on your shoulders going for it up the hill.
I figured when you were gone, it might be a location for me though.
I know, that's why you picked it. Anyways.
Bear, can you respond to Vicky, just what your service aspect of your project is?
So the service aspect was kind of all over the place. The main running one is the food pantry that I've been running since 8th grade, along with just spontaneous acts of service whenever anyone needs help, even if that means someone I'm passing in the community mentions it under their breath. I've just been like, yeah. And then I wanted to tie in walking dogs and things, but the animal shelter never got back to me. I think it's been like 4 months, maybe. Me bugging them, being like, let me pet your dogs, please. Okay,
you pet my dogs, you watch my dogs.
yeah, I'll be over to pet more dogs.
Shelly said, beautiful, raw, and real. Thank you for sharing your courageous experience and giving voice to the vulnerability that so many of us felt this year. Love you.